Hey there. So back in December, I gave a presentation on the orchids of Zambia. So my name is Nicholas Wightman. I'm a botanist and horticulturalist based in Lusaka, but working around Zambia and sometimes further afield in surrounding countries. But I came and I talked about the orchids of Zambia. So here I'm just making a quick voiceover of the same presentation to share. So Orchidaceae in general, over 700 genera, 28,000 species. It has a cosmopolitan distribution across the whole globe, with the exception of Antarctica. Now, with this, we talk about epiphytic, those plants growing on trees, as seen on the picture on the right. Then there's lithophytic, where they can also grow on rocks, and terrestrial species, those that grow in the ground. Orchids can be autotrophic, meaning they create their own photosynthate through photosynthesis with green leaves. They can be mycoheterotrophic, meaning that they have an association with a fungus, which the fungus essentially provides the nutrients to the plants, and the plant provides something back in return to the fungus. Or they can be fully parasitic, in which case then they lack any kind of coloration usually. Not all the time. Sometimes the flowers can be fairly ornamental, but they cannot produce anything themselves. They rely fully on fungus for their survival. Orchidaceae are known for their intricate pollination mechanisms. It's a really important genus or grouping of plants when it comes to things like horticulture, and then less so on the culinary side. But there are important species like vanilla and things like salep and jacanda. So in Zambia, we have roughly 48 genera and 415 taxa of orchids. I use the term taxa because sometimes there might be one species, but it could have two subspecies or so on and so forth. We have roughly 24, epiphytic and lithophytic genera that only grow on trees and or rocks, with about 102 taxa covering those types, mostly growing in woodland, forest, and riverine habitats. And then we have 24 terrestrial genera with 313 taxa growing mostly in woodland, forest, and grassland habitats. Our most common genera in Zambia are Habenaria, Eulofia, Disa, Satyrium, which are all terrestrial species. And then the fifth most common genera is Polystachya, which is an epiphytic. So it's the most common epiphytic species in Zambia. The conservation issues of orchids around the world is quite a big, important topic. Whereas here in Zambia, our conservation issue revolves predominantly around those species that make up jacanda, in terms of conserving the species that are harvested and consumed as jacanda. So very briefly, just touching on the epiphytic orchids, here we have a group of 3 different species of Polystachya. They can be quite ornamental, but they are generally on the smaller side. They do have very kind of more variation in color to the flowers, and they can be quite standoutish, or they can be quite subtle as well in terms of their coloration. And these are all kind of small to medium-sized orchids, epiphytic orchids that we have. Kind of the second big genus in epiphytes would be Bulbophyllum. Again, these are quite numerous where they occur, growing predominantly in woodland and riverine woodland habitats. Mostly small flowered, so a lot of the times people might not even really recognize that the plants are in flower. And these 3 species that I've demonstrated are all actually in flower. And when you see the picture of the actual habit comparatively to the flowers, it's hard to tell where you can actually see the flowers in that picture. Just a bit of a section of other epiphytic orchids, things like Tridactyly, Ancestral vanilla. These are all other orchid species that we will come across. Most of our epiphytic orchids are not very large flowered. They don't stand out as hugely showy plants. Um, but they range. The hundred or so species will range and support an array of different pollinators, and then those things that will actually also feed on the epiphytes as well. When it comes to our terrestrial species, we have things like early flowering orchids, then kind of mid and late season orchids. So some of the earliest flowering terrestrial orchids that we have are things like the Nervilia species. As you can see from the pictures, they are growing when there's not too much, or at least they're flowering, sorry, when there's not too much else growing in the canopy floor. As you can see from the dry leaves and seed pods that back up these plants. They tend to be quite small. The flower is not more than up to a centimeter to 2 centimeters long. With the single flowered species, the first three on the left, they tend to be quite inconspicuous. You will really only notice them as you're about to step on them. Then we have a second grouping of Nervilia that can have two or more flowers. This is represented here by Nervilia kochii, variety kochii. But again, they're not really all that showy. These are a lot of plants that you kind of have to be seeing up close to understand that it is there. But again, these ones flower at the very start of the rains, and then only after the flowers are finished do the leaves come out from them. One of our largest group of early flowering terrestrials is the Eulophias. And this is one, especially the early flowering Eulophias, are very difficult to sometimes tell apart unless you know the intricacies of what you're looking for. So here we have four different species. And to a layman's eye, one might kind of turn around and assume, well, these are all very similar and they must just be variations of one, but they're all very distinct species. There is still a bit of ongoing work with a colleague of mine from South Africa who are trying to find out how these different species are related to each other. So hopefully that will be published in the next few years as we get more material to then compare, do the DNA sequencing, and establish the floral characteristics that can tell each other apart effectively. All of these species can be found generally roughly flowering together at the same time, so that can slightly make it even more difficult to tell some of them apart. But we'll go on to the next slide, which then has another range of early flowering terrestrial eulophias, with some that actually even resemble some of the pictures from the previous slide, essentially. Again, these are all generally very small plants, usually less than 12 inches or 30 centimeters tall, that have laxly flowered inflorescences. So when we say laxly, there might be anywhere from 4 or 5 up to 10, 15 flowers, but arranged in such a way where they're not condensed. It's not a strongly condensed inflorescence where you can see it standing out from a distance. These, again, like the Nervilia, are only easily spotted when you're almost on top of the plant. However, we do have some kind of more showy, earlier flowering terrestrial Eulophia species. Most people will be more accustomed to things like the foxglove Eulophia cuculata, the one on the middle right of the picture. Equally, Eulophia livingstoniana on the far right of the picture is something that people might be more accustomed to. And the brightly colored Eulophia speciosa middle left that really stand out quite a bit and can be seen from far away standing on a stalk that might be 1.5 meters tall or so. Something like Gonykyla on the far left is a little bit more inconspicuous, but can still be, these are larger flowers than with the much smaller, earlier flowering terrestrials that are available as well. We do have a few other early flowering species in other genera as well. Holothrix on the far left is a very rare orchid, very uncommon to really come across that too Yeah, so the Holothrix is quite rare. Malaxis catangensis. It has some of the smallest flowers in all of the terrestrial species here in Zambia, rarely, measuring more than 2 to 3 millimeters across. Absolutely tiny little flowers, very inconspicuous on the ground. Disparus catangensis. There are a number of Disparus in Zambia, all very small, generally single flowered, sometimes up to two flowered per stalk. But again, rarely more than 10 centimeters, growing usually in more heavy shaded areas in quite a bit of leaf mold. And then we've got the Brachycariathus lastii, which is a mycoheterotrophic species. It doesn't produce any leaves. It could also potentially fully be a parasitic species, but very ornamental in this brief appearance of these flowers before they fade and create seed, and that plant is then dormant for the rest of the season. So the previous orchids, early flowering orchids, we were seeing from the woodlands. Now we are looking at material coming from Dambo grassland. Here, a lot of eulophias tend to predominate, and these tend to be larger and, in many cases, more showy. So, Eulophia lateralabris has some of the biggest flowers in the genus, and quite showy with that pink in there. Whereas Melangana, Flavopurpurea, and Eulophia calantha, although larger flowers, have that kind of muted whites and kind of greeny yellows in their flowers as well. Continuing on the theme of the Dambo grasslands, here we have Euphorbia and allies. I say allies because all of these species used to be in Eulophia, but some of them, the last two on the far right, have been separated out into a different genus for various taxonomic reasons. But again, these tend to be large, showy plants, especially the Eulophia horsfallsii and Eulophia angolensis. The Orthochylis walleri on the far right is very showy in that it has kind of this fantastic orange colored flower, while the Orthochylis milnei is a much more subdued, smaller plant, with these smaller, yellow, dusty, kind of sulfur yellow flowers. So, kind of having finished that up, we'll move on to the next, which tend to be mid and late season flowering. But we have to kind of briefly talk about Chicanda first, because a lot of the ones that happen later in the season tend to be those that are eaten for Chicanda. So with Chicanda, the tubers of targeted orchids are cooked as a traditional foodstuff, traditionally of the Bemba people in northeastern Zambia. Its rise in popularity has seen it transition just from being sold in mostly in the markets now to being more available in large grocery chains and even upscale restaurants. And that demand for Chicanda has led to an overharvesting of the tubers in the dambos and woodlands of Zambia, and now into surrounding countries as well. So in terms of the targeted species, the most targeted are in three genera. That's Disa, Habenaria, and Satyrium. We have these kind of larger, more impressive flowers of the Disa. Disa are some of the most ornamental of the species we have in Zambia, predominantly all growing mainly in grasslands, as you can see from these three species here. They can be either very widespread, like Disa welwitschii, variety welwitschii, and Disa hersicornis. So the two pictures on the left are very widespread species occurring in Zambia and in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, whereas Disa verdicii on the far right is only known from Zambia, DRC, in the far northwest of Zambia. So it's a much more localized plant to Kalahari sands that exist up in that far north, higher rainfall areas. Disa is a fairly large genus as well. It has quite a few different species here in Zambia. Some can be quite common, some can be quite rare. So even though Disa welwitschii, variety welwitschii, is very common, its sister taxa, Disa welwitschii, variety occultans, is much less common. I've only ever come across it once in my travels in Zambia, versus coming across variety welwitschii many a times. Similarly, Disa walleri, it tends to grow more in woodland than in grassland, and it's also much less common to come across. And then Disa aquiloba, which I do believe has been listed on the IUCN as, I think it's vulnerable, but it might even be endangered. But most of the species of orchids in Zambia are not listed at all. They have not had assessments for their conservation statuses. Just moving on, we have a few more of these late flowering species. And as you can see, they're all very ornamental. They're all very brightly colored generally, with the maybe exception of Disa engleriana on the right-hand side of the screen. Although this one does look a little more muted, it can be bright pink as well and stand out very well. But there are some that also look very similar. So Disa ornithantha on the left and Disa erubescens subspecies carsonii in the middle, at a passing glance could be construed as being the same species, but there are morphological differences that we'll be able to use to tell them apart. And then one more screen of Disa species, Acrostachia, sorry. Again, a very small flowered but densely flowered spike of flowers is a very rare one to come across. Again, I think I've only come across that once in my travels. Disa rhoperochoroides is it's a near endemic, again, shared between Zambia and DRC, but this time traveling through more the central part of Zambia up into DRC, and growing in grassland habitats. And then Disa equestris, a very widespread species, but with that kind of nice, kind of purpley blue colored flowers. So moving on, then we start looking at something like habenaria. And habenaria tend to be more concentrated in woodland habitats, but they do have a fair number of grassland species in them as well. They all tend to be on the green and white colored spectrum. So sometimes they can stand out as with Habenaria macrura on the left-hand side, or even Habenaria edgarii on the right-hand side, where that white contrasts very nicely against the flower. Or they can be almost fully green, as you see in the central picture with Habenaria holubii. These can be quite tall plants, reaching upwards of 1 meter to 1.5 meters in some instances. For some species, like something like Retinervis in the center, it can have quite a large flower spike. Or it can be very short plants of upwards of 30 centimeters tall, again, like this Habenaria verdicii on the far left. And these smaller plants will then have fewer flowers, but equally quite interesting. Now, Habenaria has quite a range of flower shapes and flower types, and hence we'll then also be looking at supporting quite a range of pollinators that exist within them. But they all tend to have kind of an insect or slightly different appearance to the flowers, and a lot more work needs to be done on trying to understand what the pollination mechanisms are for these and who is the pollinator on them. Some work has been done on certain sections. So the section that Habenaria clavata is on the far left of this picture are pollinated by hawk moths that will travel from plants to plants, carrying the pollinia, affecting pollination and moving on. And in such, some of these plants are very widespread in a woodland habitat, but never common. So that you might find one every several hundred meters. Whereas some of the smaller flowered species might be much more common in an area, and in another area you might not find them at all. So something like supplicans and papyricea could fall into those two categories. Again, Habenaria uhuensis, Habenaria jamica, again, very insect-esque in its appearance. And then on the far right, we have Habenaria villosa, which is one of the very few species we have in Zambia that has a flower color other than white or green. And in this case, these flowers are kind of a subdued yellow, and they stand out a little bit as you're walking up. But again, still very kind of subdued flower arrangements on these. So, with some of the Dambo Habenaria species, we have actually some that are quite ornamental, like Habenaria kesneriana and Habenaria kilimanjari, with their kind of white highlights, with Kilimanjari being almost completely white, and Habenaria kesneriana having the white petal lobes, those kind of white horn like structures that stick out and actually give the flower a very large appearance. It's highly fragrant and again is another one that is pollinated by hawk moths. On the far right, we have Habenaria gyrinkiana, and it was only known from some parts of Katanga province in DRC until I collected this species in far northwestern province up near the Congo border. So this is now a near endemic, just shared again between Zambia and DRC. However, most of the Dambo species tend to be these small flowered, insect-esque kind of looking plants. Habenaria kesneriana, Weberiana, and Cataphycema all tend to have these very small flowers, with something like Cataphycema not even really having very much color to it. It is strictly just a green flower. And again, we have no idea what are pollinating any of these species in particular. So still a lot of work has to be done on that. Continuing on from that, we then have things like Humilior and Pasmithii, again, more kind of green and insect-esque, with Pasmithii actually growing in water meadows. So this one grows almost exclusively in areas where there is some level of inundation of the grassland, where you're having it growing upwards of 3 to 4 inches of water where these plants grow. Very specific habitat for that species. And then on the far right, we have Habenaria macrotidium, quite ornamental species with white petals and then, or white sepals, sorry, and then these yellow petals that stick straight up. A very beautiful species, growing predominantly in very, very wet grasslands, not inundated like Pasmithii, but wet, mucky kind of soils that those ones are found in. Continuing all of these three, Calvilabris, Zambezina, and Stenarhynchus, again, all growing in very wet habitats, very specific to growing in those kind of mucky soils, and very specific where they can grow. So not very common in most cases, although Zambezina does have a little bit more wiggle room on that and can be found in sometimes drier habitats, but that tends to be associated with some level of seepage as well. So it's still wet, but it can be growing on drier hillsides that don't appear to be wet dambos, but that can still be found there. Then moving on to the final genus of the main three for Chicanda, Satyrium. Not as big, maybe a dozen or so species in Zambia, again spread between woodlands and grassland habitats. This tends to be the genus that they're either targeted for Chicanda or not. So something like Satyrium trinervi on the far left is a very sought after Chicanda species, whereas Satyrium buchanani in the central picture is much less desirable because it doesn't form the proper gelling characteristic that Chicanda is known for. Habenaria amblyosacus on the far right is a woodland species. I'm not sure about how common it is harvested, but it is quite a standout species where you do find it. Some color spectrums that do exist within Satyrium, like you can see here, we got Volkensii, which has green flowers, greeny yellow kind of flowers, and then Coreophroroides and Orbiculari, both on the middle and the right pictures, which have these kind of bright reddish colored flowers. Coreophroroides and Orbiculari are not very common to come across. Both do grow in woodland habitats, with Coreophroroides being a much taller plant and being able to be spotted from a bit of a distance, whereas Orbiculari is a very inconspicuous small plant, maybe about 20, 25 centimeters tall, even though it has these bright flowers, and has to be kind of viewed much more up close because it's not easy to spot from a distance. So with those first three genera, they are the main targeted Pichanda types. We do have a few others, things like Brachycoriathus, which can also be targeted. These tend to have not a rounded root tuber that is used. They have kind of more elongated finger-like tubers. Some can be highly ornamental, like Angolensis on the far left or Congoensis on the far right. And they can also be quite inconspicuous with Inhambinensis, which has these kind of mottled, yellowish, greeny, white flowers that are very difficult to spot unless you are standing over top of it. A few other of the highly ornamental Brachycoriathus with tenuar, pubescence, and Pleistophylla, subspecies Pleistophylla. These tend to be slightly larger plants, so you can spot them from a distance, and the flower color is quite pronounced as well on these. So again, highly ornamental when they are in flower, and not hugely common across the whole of Zambia. With the Chikanda project, it ran between 2016 and 2019. It involved things like market surveys and supply chain research, trying to understand how Chikanda makes its way from source to, or from sink to source, sorry, or source to sink is the other way around. So a lot of research in markets by an MSc student, interviewing marketeers, interviewing Chikanda cookers, interviewing harvesters, and his work contributed a lot to understanding how the supply chain operates now. We then had some various different training workshops. This was an IUCN Red List Assessor training workshop so that we could strengthen the ability for those who are on the ground and working here in Zambia to be able to actually understand how to go about defining the classification that species should be given based on their availability. There were a number of baseline surveys that happened up in Chief Kenyama's area, up in the far of northwestern province, and trying to understand what is the harvesting like happening in those areas, what are the species that are available, and hopefully providing baseline work that can then be continued going forward to see how that changes over time. We had a number of different collection trips as well. We're trying to establish how and where the spread of these species exists, in addition to being able to collect DNA material, usually through leaf samples, that can help us to then be able to understand what species are being used in the process of making Chikanda. So this was a very useful activity to start creating baselines for data sets of species harvested and where those species do occur still. And then there were a number of projects that also are workshops that looked at how can we actually start to try and grow Chikanda. So this was a green pod orchid workshop where we were looking at harvesting the seed pod before it reaches full maturity and shatters, where those seeds are then spread. And the reason for that is that if you can get those seeds just before they mature, the pod matures, there is no contamination that you will experience with those seeds. It can be sown in a much easier method to try and get as much germination as possible as quickly as possible. We contrast that with the mature orchid seed workshop, which dealt with how do you deal with the seeds once that pod has shed and that potential for contamination is increased. When all of a sudden the pod opens and it is now, all those seeds are now exposed to fungi, bacteria, protozoans, all sorts of different organisms that can hitch a ride on those seeds as they travel about. And that makes sowing them in laboratory conditions much more prone to contamination. The main issues that we still see with Chikanda is that supply cannot keep up with demand, both for Zambia in terms of the supply here, but now that supply extending into neighboring countries, especially Tanzania, DRC, and Angola. We have identified at least 60 species of what is harvested that could potentially increase as more work is done. Commercial production is not viable right now, and there is a lack of scientific and commercialization funds for any further studies as it exists. So overall, there is not a lot of funding that has been kind of put into Chicanda research since the termination of the Chicanda project that I was a part of back in 2019. There have been starts and stops of some interest showing, but there is still a lot more work that really needs to be done, especially when it comes to trying to understand the potential for commercialization of the various different species that are used to make up. It's made a lot more difficult by the fact that it's not one or so species that are used, it's the potential for 60 plus species that are targeted for harvesting. And some of those species then are very localized and more difficult to come across, which would make them less suitable than some of the more widespread species that are out there. The other issue that we do find ourselves with is understanding which are the more favored species and being able to then draw up a list to say, okay, those favored species and more widespread species, are they then able to be brought into some level of cultivation and plant breeding efforts to start to select for material that, say, like the Irish potato, where you plant one and at the end of the season you get, 10, 15, 20 potatoes. We need to develop a system where we develop varieties that same thing could be done, where one Chicanda tuber is planted, and then at the end of that growing season, where it's produced multiple tubers of a relatively consistent size that makes commercialization possible. Until something like that is achieved and we have a variety or varieties that are able to produce multiple tubers of consistent size, commercialization will not really work out. Um, and we'd also then need to be looking at different varieties that can be grown in different habitats. Across the north of Zambia, from the northwest to the northeast, we have differences that would then have to be taken into account. You'd have to take into account areas, especially in higher elevation areas. Would there be varieties that could be bred for those kinds of locations that could grow material suited to that higher elevation comparatively to things that would grow in more lowland habitats as well? So there's quite a few kind of issues to do with commercialization that we still have yet to really crack. But in order to be able to even get to that point in time, there needs to be more funding that is going into trying to understand the selection and breeding process before we can even talk about commercialization. So there's still quite a few issues that need to be done before we can look at Chicanda as a commercial activity outside of the wild harvest that is happening at the moment. So that's it. I would like to thank everybody involved in setting up the opportunity for me to give this presentation, both live and then here doing the voiceover of this to be shared with everybody. And yeah, there is a lot of interest in the flowers of Zambia. Orchids is just one side of it. And there is so much of our flora in this country that's absolutely unique and stunning. But we are losing it, faster than anything else as we look at land conversion issues across Zambia. And I would like to thank people for taking the interest in this, and hopefully I spur more people on to developing an interest in the flora. Thanks very much. Cheers.